September 3rd, 1945, 12:30 hours. Camp Weingarten, Missouri. Giuseppe Farina stood in formation with 300 other Italian prisoners of war, listening to Major William Henderson explain that they would be repatriated to Italy within 6 weeks. The war had been over for 4 months. Italy had surrendered 2 years earlier and become a co-belligerent fighting alongside the Allies. The legal justification for holding Italian soldiers as prisoners had disappeared, and the United States government wanted to reduce the administrative and financial burden of housing 51,000 men who were no longer enemies. Giuseppe should have been celebrating. He'd been captured in Tunisia in May 1943, had spent 28 months as prisoner in America, and should have been desperate to return home to Naples and the family he hadn't seen in 3 years. But as Henderson spoke about repatriation ships that would depart from East Coast ports in October, Giuseppe felt dread rather than joy. He didn't want to go home. He wanted to stay in Missouri, working on the farm where he'd spent the past 16 months, living in conditions that were better than anything he'd experienced in Italy even before the war. The announcement ended. The formation broke up. Giuseppe walked back to his barracks with Antonio Russo, another prisoner from Naples, who'd become his closest friend during captivity. They didn't speak immediately. Both were processing information that created emotional conflict they couldn't easily articulate. Finally, Antonio broke the silence. "I don't want to go back," he said quietly. "There's nothing left in Naples. The city is rubble. My father's shop was destroyed in the bombing. My mother wrote that they're eating grass to survive. What am I returning to?" Giuseppe nodded. His own family's letters had described similar conditions: food shortages, collapsed economy, destroyed infrastructure, and general chaos that made daily survival precarious. The Italy that existed in 1945 bore no resemblance to the country he'd left in 1940, when he'd been conscripted into Mussolini's army. That Italy had been poor but functional, with social structures and economic opportunities that made life possible if not comfortable. The Italy of 1945 was a devastated nation struggling to feed its population and rebuild from years of war that had destroyed nearly everything. America, by contrast, was prosperous beyond anything Giuseppe had imagined possible. The farm where he worked had so much food that excess production was being stored or even plowed under because markets couldn't absorb the surplus. The farmer's family ate 3 meals daily with meat at every meal, abundance that Italian peasants couldn't have afforded even during peacetime prosperity. The work was hard but fairly compensated. The living conditions were clean and comfortable, and the treatment was respectful in ways that Giuseppe had never experienced from authorities in Italy. "Maybe we can stay," Giuseppe said, knowing even as he spoke that this was probably impossible. "Maybe the Americans will let us immigrate." Antonio laughed bitterly. "We're prisoners of war, enemy soldiers. Why would they let us stay when there are millions of Italians trying to emigrate legally?" The question was valid, but Giuseppe couldn't let go of hope that somehow, some way, he might be allowed to remain in the country that had treated him better during captivity than Italy had treated him as a citizen. The capture that changed everything. Giuseppe Farina had surrendered to American forces near Tunis on May 7, 1943, during the final collapse of Axis resistance in North Africa. He'd been a reluctant soldier from the beginning, conscripted in 1940, poorly trained, inadequately equipped, and sent to fight in desert campaign, where Italian forces were consistently outmatched by British and American armies that had superior equipment, logistics, and tactical competence. The surrender had come as relief. Giuseppe had spent 3 years watching Italian military incompetence get his comrades killed, had endured hunger and disease that killed more Italian soldiers than combat, and had recognized months before the final defeat that Italy was losing the war and that continuing to fight was pointless sacrifice. When American tanks surrounded his position and his officers ordered surrender, Giuseppe had laid down his rifle with genuine gratitude that the war was over for him. The initial processing had been confusing, but not brutal. American soldiers had searched prisoners for weapons, separated officers from enlisted men, and organized transportation to transit camps, where tens of thousands of captured Italian soldiers were being held pending decisions about their eventual disposition. The treatment was correct, but impersonal. Prisoners were fed, provided basic medical care, and housed in tents that were crowded but adequate. Giuseppe had expected much worse. Italian propaganda had portrayed Americans as barbaric capitalists who exploited workers and treated foreigners with contempt. But the American soldiers he encountered were professional and generally decent, treating prisoners according to Geneva Convention requirements without the casual brutality that had characterized Italian military culture. The food was adequate, the medical care was competent, and the guards were firm but not cruel. The surprise had come when Giuseppe learned he would be transported to the United States, rather than remaining in North African camps or being transferred to British custody. The United States was facing severe agricultural labor shortages because millions of American men were serving in the military. The solution was using prisoner-of-war labor on American farms, under conditions that complied with international law, while addressing domestic needs that couldn't be met through civilian workforce alone. Giuseppe had crossed the Atlantic on a Liberty ship, part of a convoy carrying 6,000 Italian prisoners from North Africa to American ports. The voyage took 19 days, with prisoners housed in holds that were crowded but tolerable. The crossing was Giuseppe's first experience with the vast scale of American industrial capacity. The convoy included 40 merchant ships escorted by aircraft carriers and destroyers, demonstrating maritime power that dwarfed anything Italy could have assembled. Arrival in America had been overwhelming. Giuseppe disembarked in Norfolk, Virginia, in July 1943, processed through reception center that documented prisoners and assigned them to camps throughout the country. Within a week, he was on a train heading west toward Missouri, watching American landscape pass outside windows. Farmland that seemed endless, towns that looked prosperous and undamaged, civilians who weren't showing signs of wartime privation that had become universal in Italy. The camp that felt like home. Camp Weingarten, Missouri, was one of approximately 500 prisoner-of-war camps that the United States operated during the war, holding Germans, Italians, and smaller numbers of Japanese prisoners captured in various theaters. The camp held approximately 600 Italian prisoners who worked primarily on agricultural labor in surrounding counties, where farming operations desperately needed workers to replace sons and hired hands who were serving in the military. The camp itself was basic, but comfortable by military standards. Prisoners lived in wooden barracks with proper bunks, heating stoves for winter, and adequate ventilation for summer. Sanitation facilities met American military standards rather than the primitive conditions that Italian soldiers had endured in North Africa. Food was provided in quantities and quality that matched what American soldiers received, substantially better than Italian military rations even before the shortages that had characterized the final years of Italian participation in the war. The daily routine was structured but not harsh. Prisoners woke at 0600, attended roll call, ate breakfast, and were transported to work sites where they performed agricultural labor under supervision of farmers who'd contracted with the government for prisoner labor. The workday typically lasted 8 to 10 hours, depending on season and crop requirements. Evenings were free time when prisoners could read, write letters, play cards or soccer, or participate in recreational activities organized by camp administrators. Giuseppe had been assigned to work on the Schneider farm, a 200-acre operation growing corn, wheat, and vegetables for commercial markets. The farmer, Hermann Schneider, was third-generation German-American whose grandparents had emigrated from Bavaria in the 1880s. Schneider spoke some German that was similar enough to Giuseppe's basic German that they could communicate haltingly until Giuseppe's English improved enough to make conversation easier. The relationship between prisoner and farmer had started as purely economic transaction. Schneider needed labor, Giuseppe was available, the government facilitated the arrangement through regulations that paid prisoners 80 cents per day while charging farmers' rates comparable to hiring civilian workers. But the relationship evolved quickly into something more personal, as Schneider recognized Giuseppe's competence and work ethic. Giuseppe had grown up on a small farm in Campania, before his family moved to Naples when he was 12. He understood agriculture instinctively, knew how to read weather and soil, recognized when crops needed attention, and worked with efficiency that came from years of practical experience. Schneider appreciated these qualities and began treating Giuseppe less like hired labor and more like valued employee. By the end of the first harvest season in fall 1943, Giuseppe was eating lunch with the Schneider family rather than separately in the fields. By spring 1944, he was being invited to the farmhouse for Sunday dinners after church services that Schneider's wife insisted he attend because she believed everyone needed spiritual community regardless of nationality or prisoner status. By summer 1944, Giuseppe had become part of the extended Schneider household in ways that transcended his legal status as enemy prisoner. September 1945, and the announcement nobody wanted. The repatriation announcement in September 1945 created responses among Italian prisoners that American administrators hadn't anticipated. The expectation had been that prisoners would be eager to return home after years of captivity. Instead, significant numbers expressed reluctance or outright refusal to be repatriated to Italy, where conditions remained catastrophic despite the war being over. Giuseppe wasn't alone in his desire to remain in America. He discussed the situation with dozens of other prisoners at Camp Weingarten, discovering that most shared his feelings. They developed relationships with American families, had learned English, had adapted to American culture, and had experienced prosperity that made returning to Italian poverty seem like punishment rather than liberation. The legal status as prisoners was less important than the practical reality that life in American captivity was better than life in Italian freedom. Some prisoners approached American administrators requesting permission to remain in the United States permanently. The requests were denied. Immigration law didn't allow enemy prisoners to simply convert their status to legal residence. The regulations required repatriation, period. Any future immigration would need to follow normal legal processes that included waiting periods, quotas, and documentation that most prisoners couldn't provide. The denials created desperation among prisoners who'd convinced themselves that maybe, somehow, American mercy would extend to allowing them to stay. Giuseppe wrote letter to Hermann Schneider, asking if Schneider could sponsor his immigration. Schneider wanted to help, but explained that the process was complex and likely impossible while Giuseppe remained classified as prisoner of war. The best option would be repatriation to Italy, followed by immigration application through normal channels, but waiting lists for Italian immigration were years long, and approval wasn't guaranteed. Giuseppe also wrote to his mother, explaining that he would be returning to Italy, but hoping to emigrate back to America eventually. His mother's response was characteristically practical. "Come home, Giuseppe. Your family needs you. America will still be there later if God wills it, but your family needs you now." The guilt was overwhelming. Giuseppe had been living comfortably while his family starved. He'd been safe while they endured bombing and occupation. He'd been well-fed while they'd been desperate. His desire to remain in America rather than return to help them seemed selfish and disloyal, even though returning to Italy meant giving up prospects that would never be available there. The farewell that nobody wanted. October 12, 1945, Camp Weingarten, Missouri. The prisoners assembled for final formation before boarding buses that would transport them to trains heading to East Coast ports. Giuseppe stood with Antonio Russo and 300 others, wearing the same worn uniforms they'd been issued 2 years earlier, carrying canvas bags containing their few possessions and letters from American families they were leaving behind. Hermann Schneider had driven to the camp to say goodbye, bringing Margaret and their 2 sons despite the difficulty of leaving the farm during harvest season. The visit violated regulations about civilian contact with prisoners, but the camp commander had chosen to overlook the violation because he understood that these relationships had transcended normal prisoner guard dynamics. Margaret handed Giuseppe a package wrapped in brown paper. "Food for the journey," she explained, though Giuseppe suspected it was mostly excuse to have something to give him that would express affection she couldn't articulate directly. The 2 boys presented drawings they'd made, Crude crayon pictures of the farm with stick figures representing Giuseppe working alongside Herman. Giuseppe accepted the gifts with emotions he couldn't control, tears running down his face despite his attempts to maintain dignity. Herman shook Giuseppe's hand firmly, holding eye contact in a way that communicated everything that couldn't be said through words limited by language barriers and emotional constraints. "You've been good worker and good friend," Herman said in careful English. "You're welcome to come back any time, as immigrant, as visitor, as whatever. You'll always have place here." Giuseppe nodded, unable to speak without breaking down completely. He'd prepared speech in English thanking the Schneider family for their kindness, but the words wouldn't come. He simply embraced Herman briefly, touched the boys' heads gently, and nodded to Margaret before turning away to board the bus. Similar scenes played out across Camp Weingarten as prisoners said goodbye to farmers, families, and friends they'd developed during 2 years of captivity that had become something else entirely. American civilians cried openly. Prisoners maintained composure until buses pulled away. Then many broke down as they left behind the country that had treated them better during imprisonment than their own country had treated them as citizens. The train journey to New York took 3 days. Giuseppe and Antonio sat together, not speaking much, watching American landscape pass outside windows for the last time. The abundance was still visible everywhere. Farms prosperous and productive, towns intact and functioning, people well-fed and apparently optimistic about futures that didn't include the devastation that was waiting in Italy. The return to reality. Giuseppe arrived in Naples in November 1945 aboard a Liberty ship carrying 2,000 repatriated Italian prisoners. The voyage had taken 11 days, with former prisoners housed in conditions similar to their original Atlantic crossing 2 years earlier. Many were sick from seasickness and anxiety about what they were returning to. Naples harbor was partially destroyed, with sunken ships visible and port facilities damaged but functioning minimally. The city beyond the harbor was rubble. Approximately 60% of buildings had been damaged or destroyed by bombing, artillery, and deliberate German demolition during their retreat. The streets were crowded with refugees, displaced persons, and desperate civilians trying to survive in conditions that approached famine. Giuseppe found his family living in 3 rooms of a partially destroyed building, sharing space with another family because their original home no longer existed. His mother had aged 15 years in the 3 years since he'd last seen her. His sister Maria was skeletal despite the liberation and supposed Allied assistance. His father looked defeated in ways that went beyond physical deterioration. The reunion was joyful, but also revealed the vast gap between Giuseppe's experience and his family's. He'd spent 2 years eating well, living in comfortable conditions, and working in an environment where effort was rewarded fairly. They'd spent the same 2 years hungry, frightened, and struggling to survive each day. The divergence had created an experiential gap that couldn't be bridged through conversation. Giuseppe tried to help his family rebuild, using money he'd saved from his prisoner wages and knowledge he'd gained from working on American farm. But the challenges were overwhelming. Naples had no functioning economy, no available materials for reconstruction, no opportunities for employment that would provide wages sufficient to support family. The assistance promised by Allied occupation authorities was inadequate and inconsistently delivered. Within 6 months, Giuseppe made a decision that would define his future. He would immigrate to America legally, following the process that Hermann Schneider had explained was possible but difficult. He would apply for visa, wait for quota numbers, provide documentation proving he wouldn't become public charge. It might take years. It would definitely be difficult, but America was the only place where Giuseppe believed he could build future that included prosperity rather than just survival. The second journey to America. Giuseppe Farina arrived in New York in April 1952 as legal immigrant rather than prisoner of war. The process had taken 6.5 years, applying for visa, waiting for quota numbers, providing documentation, enduring bureaucratic delays that seemed designed to discourage applicants. But Hermann Schneider had provided employment sponsorship, documenting that Giuseppe had job waiting in Missouri and wouldn't require public assistance. The sponsorship had been essential for immigration approval that might never have come without American citizen willing to guarantee Giuseppe's economic viability. The transformation from prisoner to immigrant was complete, but also revealed that Giuseppe's fundamental relationship with America hadn't changed. He'd always understood that America represented opportunity that Italy couldn't provide. His legal status had evolved from enemy prisoner to legal resident to eventual citizen, but his appreciation for American prosperity and freedom remained constant throughout these transitions. Giuseppe worked on the Schneider farm for 12 more years, eventually saving enough to purchase his own small farm in 1964. He married an Italian immigrant in 1953, and understood through direct observation which society provided better opportunities for ordinary people to build decent lives. The answer wasn't ambiguous or subject to ideological interpretation. America offered possibilities that Italy couldn't match. But beyond economic considerations was moral dimension that prisoners like Giuseppe had recognized during their captivity. America had treated them according to international law, even when doing so was inconvenient and expensive. Americans had shown mercy when revenge would have been understandable. American families had welcomed prisoners into their homes and lives despite having sons fighting overseas against Axis forces. These behaviors revealed values and character that transcended temporary military conflicts and demonstrated civilization that was worth joining rather than opposing. The begging to stay wasn't rejection of Italian identity or heritage. Giuseppe and thousands of others maintained strong connections to Italian culture throughout their lives in America. It was recognition that America provided opportunities and values that made building good lives possible in ways that Italy couldn't offer during post-war decades when Reconstruction was slow and economic opportunities were limited. The story of Italian prisoners who wanted to stay in America revealed truth that applied broadly beyond the specific historical circumstances. Societies, 3 children, and built life that combined Italian cultural heritage with American economic opportunity. He became naturalized citizen in 1957, voted in every election afterward, and told anyone who would listen that America had saved his life twice. Once by capturing him in Tunisia, and once by allowing him to immigrate after the war. His experience wasn't unique. Approximately 15,000 Italian prisoners of war eventually immigrated to the United States after being repatriated, following legal processes that took years but ultimately succeeded because Americans who'd known them during captivity provided sponsorships and documentation that immigration authorities required. The former prisoners became American citizens, established families, and built lives that wouldn't have been possible in post-war Italy, where economic opportunities remained limited for decades. Why they begged to stay. The Italian prisoners who begged to remain in America after World War II were responding to direct comparison between American prosperity and Italian poverty that revealed truths about economic systems and social organization that propaganda on both sides had obscured. America in 1945 was the world's dominant industrial power, producing approximately half of global manufacturing output, and enjoying living standards that exceeded anything in human history. Italy in 1945 was a devastated nation where basic survival was challenging and prospects for improvement were uncertain. The prisoners had experienced this contrast personally and intimately. They'd lived in both systems, worked in both economies, reveal their character through how they treat those who are powerless and vulnerable, through whether they maintain humanitarian values when doing so is difficult, and through whether they offer opportunities based on merit rather than birth. America in 1945 passed these tests in ways that made former enemies want to become citizens, that transformed prisoners into patriots, and that demonstrated values were worth defending because they produced results that justified the claims democratic societies made about human dignity and individual opportunity. Giuseppe Farina died in 2001 at age 83, surrounded by children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren who existed because American sailors had captured him in Tunisia in 1943, and because American farmers had treated him with kindness during 2 years of imprisonment that became foundation for life he built across 5 decades as American citizen. His gravestone in Missouri includes his birth location, Naples, Italy, and his death location, Jefferson City, Missouri, documenting journey from enemy prisoner to American citizen that represented one man's experience of values that made America worth loving even for those who'd started as enemies.